Thank you very much. It's a shame that Marie-Claire's not been able to make it because she's really been quite important. Frank and I have known her for many years, and I think she was quite instrumental in getting us involved, let alone whatever role she played in the Academy. I'd like to begin by, of course, saying thank you to the Academy. This has been such a great opportunity that you've given Frank Bovenkirk and I to engage with Flanders and with you all. I suppose the greatest thing that you've given us is one of the most precious things for us all, and that is your time. The amount of time that's been given to us in the meetings that Leif was describing, the seminars, the roundtable meetings, the personal meetings, and of course today. That's a lot of investment, if I can put it crudely, a lot of investment of Flemish academic person time, and I think that's really such a valuable thing for Frank and I to receive. And I guess I should also thank you for spending the day talking in English, because I'm probably the only person in the room that needs that. If I wasn't here, apparently there are two of us. Okay, so if the two of us absent ourselves to go to the loo or get a coffee and whatever, there's a danger that you'll all start speaking Dutch. Anyway, thank you for all that. It's been a privilege, really, to have had this opportunity to try and relate my work with what I understand to be the situation in Flanders through talking to you and through, obviously, reading your own research and publications. So I do need a PowerPoint at this point. I don't know what I'm supposed to do to get it. Just press, okay. Yeah, that's true. Good, that's good. So let me begin then with the concept of integration and exactly what I am and I'm not doing. So obviously when we talk about integration, we think, primarily in terms of sectoral integration, by which I mean different sectors of social life. Employment, housing, education, political participation, and so on. We also think of it in terms of legal issues, issues to do with non-discrimination, with rights. And so, as I've got here, we tend to think very much about integration in terms of legal status, rights, labor market, residential concentration. We also tend to think of it in terms of encounters between people from different backgrounds, everyday cultural encounters. But what I want to suggest to you, and that's the point of departure for the rest of the paper and the talk, is that actually integration at that level is incomplete without what I'll call a macro-symbolic level, without macro-symbolic integration. And by macro-symbolic, I mean here something like a society's sense of itself, which of course is not monolithic. Different people, whether it's in Flanders or Britain or anywhere else, have very different ideas about what it is that we are as a society. But there is some overlap, of course, even though there's often contested elements. And that's, of course, very important, because no ideas are perfectly coherent. They're always open to interpretation, to contestation, and, of course, to further development. And the point I'm really making is that there is such an ideational or cognitive dimension to integration. And it's reflected in this quote that I have here from Gerard Bouchard and Charles Taylor, who I'm sure you've heard of, the prominent Quebecan intellectuals who led the commission on interculturalism. I forget the exact title of the commission there a few years ago. And they express the point I'm trying to express, that this level of integration is about the symbolic framework, identity, religion, perception of the other, collective memory, and so on. And that it is no less important than its functional or material framework. It's not a substitute for what I called sectoral and legal integration, not a substitute for that, but nor is that complete without engaging with this idea that a society has of itself, and therefore of who may be a member of that society, of what it means to be a member of that society, which of course I'm not suggesting will have a univocal meaning. Not at all. It will be plural and contested and so on. So I suggest that there are 4 modes of integration, which I'll mention very briefly and then talk about multiculturalism in more detail. And to take you through that, you need to refer to this table that I hope you all have in front of you, and if you don't, I have a few copies here, because it's a bit too big to put on a slide. And so the quickest way is to take you through this table. Now, you'll see that the modes of integration run across the top, and then something goes down the side: objects of policy, liberty, equality, and fraternity, which I'm sure you immediately recognize as the triadic concepts from the French Revolution, and which anyway, in many ways are the core concepts of the concept of citizenship. Fraternity, okay, that's a little bit old-fashioned, sexist. We might want to call that solidarity or you know, unity. And what I've tried to do here, very, very briefly, as you can see, is to say, well, actually, there isn't one mode of integration that works with these concepts. They all do. Assimilation, individualist integration, cosmopolitanism, and multiculturalism, they can all be understood as different ways of offering a conception of democratic civic integration. But they are different. They offer different interpretations of those concepts. And I don't want to go in detail by going through every single box in that grid, but I hope it makes sense to you to see how assimilation interprets liberty, equality, and fraternity relative to cosmopolitanism or multiculturalism, and so on. The second point I'd make about these modes of integration is that I see each of the ones moving from left to right, from assimilation towards multiculturalism, as in some ways attending to a deficit of the previous mode. So if we start with assimilation and we look at liberty, we see that the very idea that minorities must be encouraged to conform to a particular pattern erodes, limits the idea of liberty. It means minorities are not free to be exactly as they want to be. They are to follow a certain path, a certain pattern, set within certain limits. So to meet that deficit of liberty, the next mode, individualist integration, if we look at the interpretation of liberty there, we see that minorities are free to assimilate or cultivate their identities. But nevertheless, there too is a limitation there as well, because they are discouraged from thinking of themselves as members of a group, as minorities. Rather, they must think of themselves as individuals, and that's why I call that mode of integration individualist integration. Turning to cosmopolitanism, right at the very top, objects of policy, you see that cosmopolitanism does bring in ideas about society as a whole in the way that the first two don't so much, or they just use the individual's place in society to do all the work. But here we have societal ideas, especially of us and them. Looking at liberty under cosmopolitanism, you could say that cosmopolitanism suggests the maximum freedom for all individuals, and not just minority individuals, for all individuals. But on the other hand, it has no space for the idea of a group, just as individualist integration doesn't either. And turning to the bottom of the column of cosmopolitanism, under fraternity, you'll see this idea that people should be free to unite across communal and national boundaries and should think of themselves as global citizens actually means a demotion of people's sense of national identity. Because what if people do have a sense of national identity, as of course many, if not most people actually do, again, whether it's in Flanders or France or Germany or anywhere else. Cosmopolitanism pits itself against that sense of national identity because it says, well, look, let's do something else instead. Then turning to the mode of integration that, of course, I'm most interested in here, you'll see that multiculturalism is the first of these modes of integration. If we look at the top box, objects of policy box, that brings in the idea of groups. That integration is not just about integrating individuals, it's about integrating individuals and groups marked by difference, especially their treatment by discriminatory practices of state and civil society, and societal ideas, especially of us and them. So in many ways, it's like cosmopolitanism, but with an inclusion of the idea of groups. And moving down, we see that its conception of liberty is that minorities should be free to assimilate, to mix and match, or to cultivate group membership in proportions of their own choice. So at each step you can see that there's a more expansive conception of liberty involved in the modes of integration. And I would want to argue exactly the same is true of equality, because now equality will mean seeking accommodation, because if you have groups wanting to do things in a certain way, wanting to be recognized as a group, then there's an issue about accommodation and not merely, as it were, individualist integration. And one other difference at this level between multiculturalism and cosmopolitanism is that cosmopolitanism is mainly about dethroning, what I call dethroning the dominant culture, whereas multiculturalism, as I understand it, is seeking accommodation rather than dethroning. And that might well mean changing the existing conception of civil society or the society as a whole. So it's not a passive integration. It's not a dethroning, but it's not a passive integration. It's an accommodation. And it's an accommodation based on the idea that something is to be added, not subtracted, not dethroned, but to be added. So that's what I mean by a mode of integration and by modes of integration, these four. Let me move on now. So I'm now just focusing on multiculturalism, the fourth mode of integration. So as I've said, national identity assumes a certain importance for multiculturalism, which it doesn't for the others, or not in the same way. But a few key points. By national identity, of course, I don't just mean something top-down, that the state, the politicians, the legislators or somebody work out what the concept of national identity is and then hand it down or impose it on other people. Of course not. It has to be bottomed up, as well as interactions in the middle, as well as reflections and sometimes legislation or policy making at the top and so on. So it is multi-leveled and interactional up and down, as well as sideways, meaning across citizen to citizen interaction and dialogue. Secondly, there mustn't be an element where a national identity stigmatizes members of the national society, saying that some groups are lesser nationals than others, or maybe not nationals at all. And it must be inclusive. So that's the opposite of stigmatizing. It must be about bringing people in, which means it must be plural, because it must recognize difference. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a task of inclusion. And it must be forward-looking. Often, national identity and nationalism in general tends to be backward-looking to a conception of the nation formed across history, which of course is important. I wouldn't want to dismiss that. That's where we are, that's where we start. But we must at the same time be thinking, what kind of a country are we becoming? Or should we try to become? Where are we going? Not simply where have we come from. But in the middle of the slide, I have this big question in capital letters. Why? Why, someone might say, is national identity necessary to multiculturalism? And my answer is below. So my answer is that citizenship has to have this element of belonging. Citizenship is about belonging. It's not just about legal status and rights. So I've got here, that's about, fraternity, or using other words, inclusivity, belonging, solidarity, and so on. Okay, so someone will say, and this is the kind of thing that you get from people who call themselves, say, patriotic constitutionalists or patriotic, constitutionalists. They say, okay, that's it. That's what citizenship will do. Let citizenship be our sense of belonging. Why do we need something other than that? Why do we need a national identity? And so my answer to that is the last point on the slide, because for most people, this is just an empirical fact, for most people in most societies, citizenship, important though it is, as like a skeleton holding society, the structure of society, citizenship by itself is not emotional and imaginative enough to do the work of holding people together, of giving people a sense that they are a people, that they are together, that there's a sense of belonging, other than legal rights and so on. So very briefly, that's why I think national identity is part of multiculturalism. Then in my paper, I go on to mention two variations of multiculturalism, which are not my own, but are other people's. So these two variations, one of them argues that, look, we need a foundational culture, not merely a civic sense of belonging together, because this is necessary for progressive projects. But this culture, it could be Flemish culture, it could be German culture, it is contingent. It could have been something different. But we need that in order for there to be a sense of belonging, so people are willing to act together, to pay taxes, to pay for public services, alleviation of poverty, and so on. So this is a conception often self-described as liberal nationalism. So liberal nationalism goes beyond this kind of patriotic constitutionalism by saying, no, we do need a culture. It's got to be regarded as foundational, so it's not just like any other culture. It's more important than every other culture that may have to be integrated into it. And the kinds of political theorists who argue this are people like David Miller and Will Kimlicker. So that's one variation on the idea of ways in which national identity is important to multiculturalism. So that's not quite my view. The second, again, not my view, it comes from Quebec, from people like Gérard Bouchard, and to some extent also Charles Taylor, sometimes described as interculturalism, where they say there has to be a prioritization of Francophone culture, which is essential to citizenship. So the difference between 1 and 2 here is that the liberal nationalist view is that the foundational culture is contingently significant, but it could be different. We could all lose that culture. We could all have another culture. You know, I mean, over time, obviously, it wouldn't happen overnight. And in fact, if we look at the history of any major European country, it's very different to where it was 50 years ago. It's very different to where it was 150 years ago. So national cultures are always changing and evolving. And number one, liberal nationalism is built on that. But number two says no. We won't allow it to change. We want to preserve our Francophone foundational culture. That all other political projects, including integration, diversity, and so on, they must all come secondary to the preservation of the Francophone culture. That's why that's essential to citizenship. One thing both these ideas have in common, which also is part of my idea of multiculturalism, is that we can't then talk about a culturally neutral state, which is what some liberal political theorists think we should be doing, because all states will be committed to some kind of culture or other. They'll be committed to a language or languages, not to all languages, specific languages. They will be built on a certain history, a certain conception of their history, ethical traditions, what are regarded as public holidays, what is regarded as the boundary between the public and the private, and so on, which is something I'll say more about in a later session this afternoon. So my own conception of multicultural, what I'll call multicultural nationalism, it can be called something else, I'm not too wedded to the term, goes more like this. So it includes the ideas of mutual respect and reciprocity. So it's not built upon one side simply recognizing the other, but both sides respecting and giving recognition to the identity of each other. And in fact, there'll be more than two sides. It's a plurality. So it's more like, when I say here reciprocity, it's more like a multi-directional respect and recognition. And there's no absolute privileging of any culture in a unilateral way. So there can be certain kinds of privileging, and that will come across in the talk now, but also more in the afternoon, but it's not in a unilateral way. It's got to be dialogical or multilogical. It requires the assent, certainly the participation of others. No one group can say, this is the national culture. And so there is a joint effort here, and the national identity is jointly remade so all can have a sense of belonging, because we assume that at any one point some people will feel excluded. If they didn't, there wouldn't be an issue about integration. Integration only arises because some people either feel excluded or are perceived by others to be not full members. And finally, in a multinational state, like Belgium, like the United Kingdom, and in some ways like Canada, obviously, you know, with Quebec and the rest of Canada and so on, multicultural nationalism has to discourage mono-nationalisms because it needs to live up to its multinational dimension. So now, finally, getting to Flanders. So that's the kind of the intellectual background, the normative theoretical background that I then bring to Flanders. And I start by noting that there has been an argument in your academic literature beginning with an article by Dirk Jacobs published in 2004, and then I give various other references, including some people who are present here today, in fact, people who will be speaking. And the argument is that Flanders has a certain kind of institutionalized political multiculturalism, to which a few years later began to be added a new policy stream, which is sometimes referred to as citizenship trajectories, at least that's, you know, a translation from the Flemish. But the important point is the next word, that these two things have existed simultaneously and continue to exist simultaneously, perhaps contradictorily, but nevertheless simultaneously. And the scientific interest in this is that this is contrary to one prevalent view in the academic political science community, which says that multiculturalism is in retreat and has been replaced across Western Europe by something else, perhaps by something called integrationism. And the person who started off that argument is Christian Jopka in 2004. And what's interesting is that I, with colleagues, have been arguing against this, saying, look at Britain. Britain does not fit the Jopka thesis. We haven't had the kind of retreat or replacement of multiculturalism that, say, the Netherlands clearly have had, and that Jopka is building on. But what's now really interesting for me is Flemish authors have been saying the same about Flanders, and they don't know about Britain, and we don't know about Flanders. So this is very valuable. I've already learned something. A valuable discovery for me is that we have these two parallel anti-Jopka arguments going in two different parts of Western Europe at the same time. So this is I've taken from an article by Ilka Adam, the 2013 article. I've called this political multiculturalism. She just calls it multiculturalism. And she says, look, here are the 5 constitutive elements of multiculturalism in Flanders that started in the late 90s, have developed, have not retreated. In fact, they've been strengthened or developed. So firstly, she says, there are integration centers offering socio-juridical guidance and socio-cultural activities for the immigrant public. Secondly, the public financing of grassroots ethnic minority organizations and the emancipatory role assigned to activities that valorize their cultures of origin. Thirdly, the establishment of a mainstreaming policy incorporating cultural diversity and immigrant integration concerns within most policy sectors, coordinated by the Interdepartmental Commission for Ethnic Minorities. So that's 3 out of the 5. The remainder are the renaming of the target group from immigrants, which is obviously not a citizenship naming, to a multiculturalist labeling, ethnocultural minorities, meaning they're minorities within the nation of Flanders as opposed to immigrants who are clearly outside a national belonging. And finally, the creation of the Minorities Forum to allow ethnic minorities organizations and their federations to prepare joint policy positions. So this is at the level of policies and institutions. I didn't actually find much in English at the level of evaluation. How has this worked? How is it being implemented? What are the outcomes? How might it be further developed? And in fact, I hope to hear that, hope to talk to you about that today, or about to what extent ethnic minorities were part of the public life of Flanders beyond even these items. I didn't find much data on that, at least not in English. It could be my fault, but I hope we'll begin to remedy that. And one of the things that Ilka Adams' article also points to is that there's a certain amount, not as much, I would say, as in Britain or Canada or the United States, but there is a certain amount in Flanders of remaking the national identity. So she said that the VLD, the Liberal Party in Flanders, introduced the idea of a new Fleming or new Flemings, have created an award for a new Fleming since 2009. I'll just read you something about that, what that is. I'm sure you're probably all familiar with it, but as I'm not, it'd be good to remind myself of what is being said here. So she says here, the awards for someone who has contributed by his or her merits to the enrichment of Flanders and is an example for the new Flemings and for Flemings in general. Now, of course, this can be very patronizing and can be done badly, or it can be done well. So I'm not sure how it's been done. It's something we can talk about, and you might say, oh no, look, it's a real disaster. But at least I'm pointing to it as an example of what should happen in what I'm calling a multicultural nationalist political orientation. But as I say, just because something should happen doesn't mean it happens well. There are bad ways of doing things as well as better ways of doing things. Secondly, it's clear that there is a binationalism in Flanders because people think of themselves as Flemish and they think of themselves as Belgian. And this is true in general, and ethnic minorities are not discouraged from joining this binational way of thinking. And this is based upon, the last 2 points here are based upon a summary of various surveys in a very recent publication by Patrick Lubick, who will be speaking shortly, and a co-author, Sina Deret. And they point to two survey-based reasons why binationalism has something positive to offer to Flemish multicultural nationalism. Those terms are my terms. The first argument is that actually the people who think of themselves as not just mono-Flemish, just mono-national Flemish, are more open to minorities. And clearly multicultural nationalism requires an openness to minorities. So that's a positive, if contingent, reason why binationalism has something positive to contribute to Flemish multiculturalism. And the second reason is they say, well, they don't put it quite like this, this is my own argument, is that they point to the fact that a lot of Flems do identify with Belgium and Belgian national identity. In fact, more than a lot, a majority do in different kinds of ways. And so my point, based on the perspective of multiculturalism I was describing before, is that multiculturalism is always about giving weight, normative weight, social weight, sometimes policy weight, give weight to identities that matter to people. So if a majority of Flems think they are Flemish and Belgian, well, that's good. Multiculturalism should give weight to that binational identity. So that's the kind of perspective of multiculturalism that I brought with me, and this is how, looking at your literature and talking to you in various group meetings, I think it can apply to the existing situation, and I'm looking forward to what the other academic experts have to say. Thank you.